conflict in Gaza rages on as the death toll nears another tragic milestone. Hello, everyone. I'm Asiye Namdar in for Anna Naidu, and you're watching The Heat. Infants, children, and women are among the dead in some of the latest Israeli strikes in Gaza. According to Gaza's health ministry, the Palestinian death toll is now close to 46,000. The United Nations Children's Agency, UNICEF, says at least 74 children were killed in Gaza in just the first week of 2025. Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis continues to remain dire. Hunger is rampant and critical medical supplies are badly needed. On Wednesday, the Red Cross called for access to bring more aid to the Palestinian territory. A lot to talk about. Joining me now from The Hague in the Netherlands to discuss the crisis is political analyst Nour Odeh. Nour, welcome to the program. Well, the new year began the same way 2024 ended, with more losses, more suffering, and more heartbreak. The Palestinian death toll now nearing a staggering 46,000 people. Is there any end in sight to this nightmare?
Well, one would hope so, Asiye, but unfortunately at this point, I think we need to be realistic and to diagnose this tragic situation quite clearly. And what we have at our hand is Israel having succeeded in normalizing a genocide that has been live streaming for 15 months on world screens. And to the outrage of public around the world, yet governments have almost internalized and normalized the rhythm of extermination that is happening in Gaza. There are ebbs and flows. You see days where there are 50 people, 50 Palestinians killed. Some days are even more brutal, where you have up to 100 or even more. But more or less, Israel has put the world in this routine of normalizing the genocide. And without something happening to change that rhythm, to change that pattern of impunity, of brutalization, by way of sanctions, by way of imposing a price for the continuation of this mass slaughter, then there is really very little by way of hope that one can have that there's an end in sight at this point.
Well, Israel, for its part, has angrily denied allegations of genocide. Nour, I want to talk about the children of Gaza. At least 74 killed just during the first week of 2025. That's according to UNICEF. What is life like for some of these young victims who may have survived the physical wounds? But boy, the emotional scars, the trauma.
Listen, Palestinian children are surviving a living hell in Gaza. And if you're a Palestinian child born anywhere near 2005, all you have seen are wars, displacement, and brutalization. And in the past 15 months, almost all of the children in Gaza have been displaced at least once. And they have lost family members. They've gone hungry. They eat once or twice a day, and those are the lucky ones. So we are talking about a destroyed, shattered generation of children, about thousands of orphans, about the world's highest number of child amputees crammed in this small enclave that is the Gaza Strip. So that, and again, this goes back to the allegations of genocide, which enjoy quite a large consensus among the experts on the subject. The genocide is not just about the killing, it's about what happens to an entire people. And so you have a population that is predominantly young, that has been denied school for 2 school years now, that has no access to health, no access to clean water, no access to hospitals either, because most of them have been bombed. And even those that are struggling to stay open can barely provide the basics in terms of services. So this is a generation that is scarred emotionally, that is in its DNA now, a generation that has gone hungry, that has experienced starvation. They have been starved for over a year. Recovery doesn't start when the guns stop. Recovery can only start when all the conditions for it would be available, and that would require a lifting of the siege. That would require a guarantee that this is not going to happen again. And again, we go back to the need to make sure that this impunity ends, because that is the only way that Gaza can move forward. It's not just about stopping the bombardment.
I want to talk about the situation with the hospitals and healthcare facilities that you mentioned, but I want to dig a little deeper into the malnutrition and hunger. How are people surviving? I don't understand. What are they living on? What are they eating?
They're living on the very, very basic. And if you're a mother or a father, then you know that in situations where there is very little, you will give most of that to your children. So you have a situation where the children who are lucky enough to still have a living parent, they're being cared for best as they can by their parents. They survive mostly on one meal a day, and sometimes not even that. There is water, mostly not clean, not drinkable. And the staple food is bread, if you can find it, if you can afford the flour, if Israel allows the trucks into the Gaza Strip. So this is a situation of prolonged starvation. It's not about one day going hungry or even 2 days. It's not about a bad week. It's been 15 months of this nightmare. This has immediate effects on health, on the the body's ability to resist disease, to resist the cold. We've seen dozens of cases of people dying from hypothermia, and this is not because temperatures went below zero. It's because the body is so fatigued it simply couldn't cope with one more night in a tent in extreme weather for that region. And so you have a situation of prolonged suffering, one that has immediate effects, but also long-term effects, like stunted growth, like an effect on the IQ of these children moving forward if this engineered starvation continues.
And of course, there's also a breakdown of law and order. The UN says things are at a breaking point because of continued Israeli attacks on aid workers. There have been reports of armed men stealing nearly 100 trucks of food and other humanitarian aid in recent months. Israel, Nour, says aid is getting through, but Hamas is stealing that aid.
Yeah, you know what? After 15 months, it's really become almost insulting to have to deal with these kinds of statements. Time and again, humanitarian organizations and human rights organizations have debunked Israeli claims about allowing enough humanitarian assistance. So let me put this to rest. Before the war, before the genocidal war on Gaza started, Israel allowed 500 trucks of goods every day into Gaza. At the time, Israel had been imposing a siege on Gaza. So 500 trucks were not normal, were not enough, but they were enough to make sure that people didn't go hungry. And already 80% of the population in Gaza before the genocide were dependent on international assistance for food. Now, since this genocide has begun, the situation has gotten dramatically worse, especially in northern Gaza. And the numbers are there, they're clear, they're irrefutable. And the attacks on humanitarian organizations are also irrefutable. Israel has targeted UN convoys time and again, even though they do not move 1 meter in Gaza without coordinating with the Israeli army. And just 2 days ago, the WFP convoy came under attack. And it's important to remind the viewers that these convoys do not move on their own. They don't just decide to get in a truck and move from point A to point B in Gaza. Every movement is monitored and coordinated with the Israeli army. Every person in that truck is in the truck with the knowledge and the acceptance and the permission of the Israeli army, and yet humanitarian workers continue to be targeted and killed. The breakdown in law and order is not a mishap. It is not something that happened by chance. It is the direct result of action taken against any attempt to maintain law and order, to protect those aid convoys, and to alleviate the suffering caused by a pronounced policy by Israel, which is to starve people of food, of water, of fuel, of all elements of life.
Doctors, medical workers continue to be killed and wounded. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, more than 1,500 of those killed, in fact, have been healthcare workers. Nour, while so much focus has been on the Gaza, we've got to talk about what's happening in the West Bank. Israeli settler violence has peaked dramatically. Give us a sense of what's happening there and what life is like there for Palestinians whose homes have been burned and attacked by these settlers.
Look, life in the West Bank is a life of isolation. It is true that this is a much larger territory than the Gaza Strip, but what the geography of occupation has done in the West Bank, Asia, is to divide it into small, isolated islands. Each and every one of those islands is surrounded by Israeli settlements and by Israeli settlers and by settler-only roads. The movement of Palestinians from one Palestinian city to another in the occupied West Bank is governed by that geography of occupation and by military checkpoints. So if you live in Ramallah and you need to get to Bethlehem, for example, for work, then you must plan around all of those restrictions, and you must take into account the fact that if an Israeli settler attacks your car, there is no one that you can call for help. Not the Israeli police, not the Israeli army, and not the Palestinian police, who are not allowed on those roads, who are not allowed to fulfill their duties towards the Palestinian people because of that geography of occupation. So it's a life of isolation, of complete impunity, and one where you can lose your home or your land at a whim, and because an Israeli settler decided it was time for you to go.
All right, Nour Odeh, we certainly appreciate you talking to us. Thank you so much, Nour Odeh, joining us from The Hague in the Netherlands. For more now on all of this, joining me is Sara Yael Hirschhorn. She's a historian at the University of Haifa and a fellow of the Jewish People Policy Institute in Jerusalem. Also with us is political analyst Khalil Sayegh. He is also co-founder and president of the Agora initiative. And joining the discussion too is Nabeel Khoury. He's a former U.S. diplomat and Middle East expert. Thank you all for being here. Sara, let me begin with you. We just spoke to a Palestinian political analyst, Nour Odeh, who repeatedly accused Israel of conducting a genocide in what's happening in Gaza. There have been accusations Israel continues to attack hospitals, refugee camps, schools, and aid workers. What is your reaction?
Look, my reaction is the same as it's been for the last 460 days here in Israel, which is that there is a brutal war that began on October 7th when Hamas invaded Israeli territory, took over 230 Israelis hostage. 2 more bodies were just found of Muslim, Arab, Bedouin Israelis who were apparently killed by Hamas. And we have seen a devastating war with profound and grievous humanitarian consequences, but I don't think it meets the criteria of internationally recognized definition of genocide. That being said, we are now 460 days into a war that has affected both Israelis and Gazans with significant consequences: the loss of human life, disruption of daily activities, targeting of educational, cultural, and other institutions. That includes here in Israel, where Hamas has continued to shoot off rockets at Israeli civilians for the last 460 days as well. So I think we have a situation where civilians on both sides are paying the price for the consequences of a war and frankly, of the bad decisions of Hamas to begin this war on October 7th and put its own people at using its own people as human shields, and the cost of immense human life, and also of the bad decisions of Israeli military and political leaders that have continued this war for 460 days without finding a way to release the hostages or come to some kind of ceasefire agreement at this very late stage in a war that has gone on now for almost a year and a half. So I think we have a terrible situation that needs to come to an end.
A terrible situation and catastrophic humanitarian conditions in Gaza. So many hospitals damaged or destroyed in Israeli attacks. Khalil, let me turn to you. What has this done to Palestinians who are in need of urgent medical care when hospitals are either badly damaged or bombed and destroyed? You yourself have experienced loss in your family because your family members could not access health care.
Yeah, the situation is already devastating in Gaza. Over 45,000 people have been killed by the Israeli bombardments. I think that the type of killing that we're witnessing in Gaza, as you mentioned, the direct killing by the Israeli bombardment and the indirect killing by the Israeli policies. Since day one of this war and this genocide against Gaza, the Israeli policies has been very clear. Mr. Yoav Gallant, the former Minister of Defense in Israel, have stated very clearly that there will be no water, no electricity, no medicine, nothing that will get into Gaza until, quote unquote, the hostages will be released. So it was very clear that the Israeli policy since day one is genocidal toward Gaza. And part of these genocidal actions that we've been taking is the destruction of hospitals and the destructions of medical facilities, which as a result, a lot of people have died. People are dying because of lack of medicine. Other people are dying because they're injured and they cannot be transferred out of the Gaza Strip. Also, Israel has issued a strict siege on Gaza since the beginning of this war, and especially after May of 2024, when the Israelis occupied the borders between Rafah and Egypt, which has resulted in a complete closure of the border between Gaza and Egypt. So the situation continues to be devastating. The death toll is still rising, again, because of the direct killing by Israel and the indirect killing because of lack of medicine, water, and food.
Nabeel, you're a veteran diplomat. It seems like negotiations to reach some kind of truce or ceasefire in Gaza, they're really not going anywhere despite best efforts in talks that have been going on in Doha. What do you think is the holdup? I mean, it certainly seemed to work, at least on a temporary basis, for the most part in Lebanon. Why has it been so difficult for Gaza?
Well, look, first of all, there's no point in wasting time trying to find a proper definition of what's going on in Gaza. I think the United Nations has spoken, the International Criminal Court of Justice, public opinion worldwide is very much against the logic that Sara presented. Nevertheless, I think beyond the humanitarian toll that this war has taken, there is a significance to the fighting, which goes back to your question as to why diplomats have been working tirelessly for 15 months and yet have failed to bring about just a ceasefire, let alone peace. What's going on is beyond just a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. This is nothing short of trying to finish a colonial project that started in 1947. As far as the violence in Gaza is concerned, that part is almost accomplished from the Israeli point of view. The northern Gaza has been devastated and depopulated. Ultimately, the right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu means to depopulate the entirety of Gaza and allow settlements to be established there. Beyond that, violence in the West Bank shows that it's proceeding gradually, perhaps slower than it has been going in Gaza, but it's going in the same direction.
Well,
The only thing this is reminiscent of is what happened to Native Americans when white European settlers came, fought wars, practically decimated the population, pushed the rest on reservations, and that was the end of any hopes of Native Americans having any kind of autonomy.
Sara, let me turn to you. The longer this crisis drags on in Israel and hostages, whether bodies are being found and hostages are not being released, what is the overall view among Israelis, and how much of this is about political survival for Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, we've walked by the faces of these hostages at every bus stop and lamppost and billboard in Jerusalem and across this country for 460 days. And there's no doubt that every Israeli wants their family members home. The question is Hamas going to be willing to release all the hostages at one time? Will they only be willing to release those they consider to be in humanitarian categories, like women and children and elderly men, perhaps leaving the rest behind as forever? How many hostages are even still alive? Does Hamas know where they are located and who they are being held by? Presumably not only by Hamas, but by Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other splinter terrorist factions. Will the bodies of dead hostages also be released? So there are many questions here, but there's no doubt that the Israeli public overwhelmingly wants the hostages, whoever may be alive, to be able to return in some degree of health and life. The Netanyahu administration's confounding approach to stalling on the hostage deal and the feeling that there is no pressure here, despite the fact that hostages may have only minutes or hours or days to live, is utterly baffling and, I think, incredibly enraging to the vast majority of the Israeli public. Now, it seems there has been in recent days and weeks some softening amongst Netanyahu's coalition. Some of his ultranationalist partners had vowed that if a hostage deal would preempt Israel being able to either return to the Gaza Strip to continue military operations at a later date or just definitively come to a ceasefire, they had suggested that they would pull out of the coalition. We've seen some softening of these approaches, particularly from Bezalel Smotrich, the head of the Jewish Home Party, in recent days. And there's a sense also that even if this deal went through, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the head of Jewish Power, would either be marginalized or he could be, or he would change his viewpoints on toppling the government. So I think this gives Netanyahu more maneuverability, but frankly, the rest of the Israeli public who care less about Netanyahu's political futures and wants to see their family, friends, and fellow citizens back home in Israel after being in, hellish conditions for 460 days. Yeah, hellish conditions for the families and hellish conditions for Palestinians in Gaza. And of course, we have incoming President Donald Trump taking office in a few weeks from now. This question is for both Khalil and Nabeel. Trump has said he has warned that all hell will break out if the hostages are not released by the time he takes office in a few weeks. Khalil, how worried are you about what's going to happen when Donald Trump takes office? And please keep it quick because I also want to get Nabeel's take on this.
To start with, there are two hostages problems. There are the hostages that are held in Gaza by Hamas, and that's a war crime that Hamas has committed on October 7th. And there are many hostages that have been detained in the Israeli prisons, including dead bodies for decades in the Israeli prisons.
I asked specifically about Donald Trump. I was asking about Donald Trump.
When it comes to Donald Trump, he has promised hell on earth if hostages are not released by the time of the inauguration. I don't think there is more hell to be brought to Gaza more than what they already experienced. I think that there is movement toward a ceasefire. At least the partial first stage seems to be in reach between Hamas and Israel. There have been compromises on the Israeli side to promise some wording that seems like a permanent ceasefire, but it's not a permanent ceasefire. On the Hamas end, there has been some concessions, such as providing the list of the 34 members of the hostages in Gaza, and as well as to agree that it will be of a 3 stages, while Hamas has, at the beginning, emphasized that they want one ceasefire permanently that will release all hostages at once.
All right, Nabeel, let me turn to you again. You've done diplomacy for decades. How concerned are you about what's going to happen when Donald Trump takes office? Donald Trump has close ties with Benjamin Netanyahu. Are you worried this crisis is going to keep dragging on, or are you perhaps optimistic that there will be some kind of deal, some kind of ceasefire once he begins his second term?
I'm just glad I'm retired and not working at the State Department. So am I optimistic? Not at all. He has completely sided with Israel. Anything that the Biden administration has de facto agreed to in terms of what the Israeli government has done, Trump will make de jure. In other words, he will give them political legitimacy for any territory they take, any territory they choose to keep, and absolutely anything they choose to do with the Palestinian population. So I am totally pessimistic as to what will happen in the next couple of years.
And Sara, I'll give you the final word. What is your sense with Donald Trump coming back to the White House?
Well, I think Donald Trump is, as Nabeel has pointed out, is a very, very unpredictable character who seems at the moment to be an ally of Benjamin Netanyahu, but it's also possible that his feelings can change on a dime. So it'll be very difficult to tell what is going to happen, although I agree with Khalil that it's very hard to imagine what more hell could break loose over Gaza in order to free the hostages. So even if Donald Trump has aspirations of grandeur in being able to not only release the hostages, but execute what he, famously called, the world's biggest deal, I think we should all remain skeptical until proven further.
Well, we certainly appreciate all of you coming onto the program. Sara, Khalil, Nabeel, thank you very much. And we'll have to leave it there. Thank you, all of you at home, for watching another edition of The Heat. I'm Asiyeh Namdar in Washington.